Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 135 in the series. Welcome back to the yarn room. It's lovely to see all of you on this autumn day. It's Sunday morning here. The leaves have almost fallen off the trees. We had an extended, beautiful autumn this year because there was no freezing, there was very little wind, and all the trees just turned like the most magnificent colors. So we've been really enjoying that. And I feel like I've heard from people all around the Northeast and the Midwest that the foliage has just been amazing. So I hope it's been pretty in your area and a good fall for you. This episode is chock full of wackiness. I'm going to call it From Space Invaders to Gryffindor, and I'll explain that in a minute. I have the winner of the last giveaway for a couple of skeins of Shorn yarn. I have an announcement about the Shorn yarn patterns. I have a work in progress. This is where we're going to get to Space Invaders. I have been doing some wool felting, and I have some sweater cloning / modification discussion for you in case you're working on a store-bought sweater and you're trying to modify it. I've got a couple of tips, and I do have a whole class on that out there in Teachable Land. So we're going to talk all kinds of different fun things today. If you're looking for me online, you can find just about everything at the website, which is knittingthestash.com. And if you're looking to get in touch with me, knittingthestash@gmail.com is the best contact. I do check my Ravelry box and the YouTube comments and all those things, but not as often as I check email. So if you do need to get in touch with me, that's the best way. If you're interested in joining our Saturday Zoom session, you can also email me there and I'll send you the Zoom link. And if you're interested in joining our CAL for the year, it's all about, we called it originally TV knitting, but it's kind of media knitting. So it's like knitting based on books and television shows and movies and things like that. So if you're interested in that, we have a Ravelry thread going on, lots of people picking patterns. I finished my Moria scarf from Lord of the Rings, and I do still have a plan for this beautiful striped sweater that I saw on the Miley Cyrus movie. I haven't gotten to it yet. I've had a few questions about it. I will get to that sweater, but it's going to take a little planning. So there's no pattern. I just have a couple of fuzzy, blurry photographs, so we'll see how that goes. If you are coming back to the podcast, thank you so much for coming back, and thank you to the podcast producers. That is Rose and Erica, Nargis and Kendra. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. We do have a Patreon link up there and a coffee link. So thanks to everybody who's been donating to the podcast so that this can all run smoothly and giveaways can be sent out in the mail and all that kind of support. I really appreciate it. I also have a new giveaway for you. So we're going to have fun this episode. Yeah. And if you're new to the podcast, this one is usually mostly about garment design, garment modification, and we're going to do a bunch of that kind of thing today. So welcome. It's lovely to have you here, and I hope you find some things that are fun to listen to while you're knitting or crafting or making or whatever it is you're doing, right? Now, the last episode was a yarn launch for Shorn 4, and that is my own small batch farm yarn that I produced from Kathy Capel's beautiful fleece from Seven Sisters Farm, and it is a gorgeous gray 3-ply DK weight this year, a lot like Shorn 2. So if you were looking for Shorn 2 back in the day and it sold out so fast, there is still plenty of Shorn 4 left. But I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for the wonderful reception of this yarn. Thank you so much for your orders, for your support, for all of your kind words about it. It just means so much to me because this is my my annual labor of love to get this fleece from Kathy, to send it off to the mill, get it back, to work with designers to get the patterns all set. It's just a really fun thing that I like doing each year. And this year's yarn is just, I've heard from so many people who have received it in the mail now that it's just like the most squishable, and I have to agree. I love this yarn so much. And the patterns that are associated with this yarn, we still have kits in the shop. So we have the Ziggy hat, which is a very simple cabled texture pattern. And this is going to be for the giveaway as well at the end of the episode. We have the beautiful Hollyhock wrap that was designed by Mary Rawick. Beautiful cables, really plump and kind of pop off the surface of this. Love this one. And Kendra Castillo designed a beautiful Vincent's cowl, which is a cool V. This is a great beginner project if you're interested in starting to work on cables and thinking about texture and ribbing and stockinette and all those fun, simple things, but it just turns out so well, and people have been loving this pattern. It's been flying off the shelf, so I'm very happy to have Kendra involved in this whole Shorn process. All of the patterns, so the Ziggy hat, Kendra's pattern, the Vincent cowl, and Mary's pattern, the Hollyhock wrap, are all going to go up for individual, like you'll be able to get them individually on Ravelry starting November 1st. So we have kits in the shop where you can get the pattern and the yarn, but you can also just get the patterns on Ravelry beginning November 1st. So if you've been interested in picking up the cowl pattern or the hollyhock wrap pattern or the Ziggy hat pattern, those will all be over on Ravelry in just a couple of days, which is really exciting. So please go out, support the designers. They did so much wonderful work on these patterns, all kinds of different charting and going through my tech editing process with them, and they were wonderful to work with, and I just want to send their patterns out into the world and have everybody enjoy them. So please help support them by going over to Ravelry and checking out their work. So aside from the Shorn launch, which has been going wonderfully, thanks to all of your support, thank you so much again, I have been working on this sweater in the background, and it is the reason that this episode is called Space Invaders to Gryffindor. So let me explain. It looks like a Jennifer Steinguess pattern, and it is now. But when I was knitting it, my whole plan for this sweater was to just kind of like go for it, you know, just like knit the body, decide what I was doing with the yoke later, and just kind of like wing it, because I had done the Lopi sweater experiment a few episodes back, and I knew my gauge and I knew my needle size and I knew exactly the number of stitches that I needed for each part of the sweater to make it all work out to fit me perfectly. So I was just kind of like, I'll ad-lib this, it'll be fun, I'll design a yoke, it'll be cool. So I was knitting along on this and I was working it from the bottom up, just kind of like I did for my Weatherman sweater a few months ago, using my stitch counts. I did my split hem, I did my provisional cast on for my sleeves. I have tutorials up about both those things. The provisional cast on for the sleeves is particularly interesting because if you're working a bottom up sweater, then if you cast on provisionally for the sleeves, you can work the sleeves top down. I find that infinitely useful because I'm always catching the sleeves of my sweaters on everything, and that's the part that usually needs to be mended. So if they're knit from the top down, it's a much easier process to mend them because you just pull it out, put in your lifeline, pick up your stitches, whatever you do, and then just, you know, unravel up to the point where it needs to be fixed, and then you just knit back down. It's like the best way to mend sweaters. So whenever I can knit a sleeve top down, I usually do. And the provisional cast on allows you to do that. So right when you get to the point in your bottom up sweater where you're putting your stitches on waist yarn for your armpit here, and you would normally knit the sleeves separately and join them to the body at that point, instead you just continue along, put these stitches on waist yarn, and then provisionally cast on around your arm. Yay! Then you have your stitches all ready to pick up when you're done with your yoke, and you can just move on with it. It's just an easier process. I love it a lot. I think it works not for every sweater, of course, but for any of these kind of yoked sweaters, it tends to be a great way to go about doing the sleeves. So I had gotten to that point, and I had planned an entire yoke based on the Space Invaders video game of my youth. So I had worked out the pattern repeat. I think I had a 15 stitch pattern repeat. I had some really adorable little Space Invader creatures, and I had a little chart. I was ready to go, and I had purchased this yarn, the red yarn, completely on sale maybe a month ago. And also in that set of yarn that was on sale were some colors like grays and yellows, and I was like, okay, so you know, I'll just figure something out with the grays and the yellows. So I decided to do my aliens, even though Space Invaders typically would be like a black background with like really colorful aliens. I decided to do my aliens in a yellow. Well, when you put this color with the red, it turns into the house colors of Gryffindor. And I was sitting there knitting, I think I was on the third or fourth row of my little pattern for the Space Invaders, and I kept looking at it and thinking, there's something about this. What is it, you know? And Spencer looked over and he said, they look like school colors. It looks like Harry Potter's Gryffindor. And it did. It looked just like those red scarves they would wear in the movies with the yellow kind of like stitching on it, which is, you know, those colors are just so iconic at this point. So yeah, and Spencer was kind. I think he said something like, well, you could just keep going and see how it actually turns out, you know? And I looked at him and said, is this like when I started painting that wall in that old house, you know, it was kind of this Pepto-Bismol pink, and in the little patch it looked okay, but then once I finished the entire room it was not good. So we went with our gut on this one and basically pulled out the Gryffindor pretty quickly. So no more Gryffindor meets Space Invaders for this particular sweater. So that left me with the question of like, what am I going to do with the yoke? I had some beautiful yarn, some Lopi yarn left over from the Weatherman sweater. So I had some grays and whites and this kind of dark ash color. And I thought, oh, there've got to be some other Lopi sweaters out there that I've been thinking about. Maybe I'll just go for that. Because at this point, I had been working on the chart for a few different nights. And I had been working on the repeat and trying to get it just right. And I was basically too exhausted to go back to my Stitch Fiddle program and try to create a new yoke for myself. So, and I really wanted to get this sweater like done because it's fall and I want to wear it. So I just decided to go for a kind of tried and true, let's go see what other yokes are out there in the world. And one of the ones in my queue was the, I hope I'm not mispronouncing it, it's Tresta? The Tresta sweater by Jennifer Stein Guess. And I was sitting there kind of wondering like, can I just riff on this? You know, because I could see it in the pictures and I'm thinking to myself, knitting from photographs, I do that a lot. Should I just riff on this? Oh, but then what about the decreases that are going to be in the yoke? It would be easier to just buy the pattern. And then I scrolled down through Ravelry and it said the pattern was from Len 3, I always mispronounce it, the wonderful knitting, Nordic Knitting magazine. And of course I had this upstairs. So my Stash busting sweater from Sale Yarn and Stash continues to be a Stash busting sweater. So this is actually a magazine that, a copy of the magazine that I already had. So I flipped to the beautiful pattern and I'm thinking to myself, number one, I have my yoke stitches set up for a 15 stitch repeat. So we all know that when you have multiples of a certain number that, certain numbers are only divisible by certain numbers without having half stitches or, weird divisions. So as I was looking at the Tresta pattern, I was trying to determine, oh boy, like what's our repeat here? The repeat, it turns out, is a 12 stitch repeat that's actually a 6 stitch repeat. So within the 12, you actually are repeating yourself twice. So it was a 6 stitch repeat, and one thing to know about repeats, if you are doing this kind of modification for yourself, is that the smaller the repeat is, the easier it is to accommodate different stitch counts and sizing, right? If you have a big repeat of say 15, 20 stitches, then you can only, and you want to keep that repeat whole, then you can only have very limited sizing because you have to repeat that particular number of stitches all the way around. So you can only do, X number of stitches or X number of stitches, like multiples of that bigger number. Whereas if you have a smaller number for your repeat, say it's 6 or even 12, you have much more freedom because if you needed to put in an extra repeat, you're only dealing with 6 extra stitches, which in this particular gauge is about an inch, right? So give or take an inch on the top. Some people might say make or break, but if you think about the ease of a sweater, a few inches here or there isn't going to make or break a sweater, especially if it's not a totally fitted sweater. So this actually turned out well. It was a 12 stitch repeat instead of 15, but I managed to, I had to pull the whole yoke out. So I pulled it back to, right after my provisional cast on, and I think I just had to lose 2 stitches. I think that's what I had to do. I think I had to like knit 2 together twice. So I think I did that right here and right here as I was going around in a place that nobody's going to notice, right? Just to get to the right stitch count, which would be a multiple of 12. But if I had needed to, I could have just done multiples of 12 plus 6, right? These are cool things to think about if you're trying to work on your own yoke and just be a little bit of a rebel. Like I was feeling. So the chart is beautiful. This pattern's beautiful. I'm not following the pattern though, really. I was just using it for the chart. And so I did use the pattern for my decreases, which left a very open sweater. If you've ever seen the Tresta sweater on Ravelry, you'll see that most people wearing it, the neck opening is rather wide. So I didn't do all of the extra rows up in here because I was thinking about my yoke depth. I have a tutorial video about that as well. And so I was thinking about my row gauge and how many rows I could fit in to this portion of the sweater before it would start to kind of like choke up on the front, be too high or be too baggy in the armpits, right? So I knew I had a certain number of rows, and I knew that the rows that the pattern included for a lot of its decreases up here, that was going to be too many rows. So I collapsed a bunch of the final decreases up here so that they happen more rapidly than they would have in the original pattern. But I did that because I wanted to preserve the actual pattern, which is quite beautiful and only contains a couple of the decreases you actually need to get up to a small enough neck size by the end. So I rapidly decreased in here, and I don't think it makes a big difference on the sweater. I think it's quite nice. And then I worked an I-cord, an applied I-cord bind off here. And the nice thing, I mean, there's so many nice things about an applied I-cord bind off, but one of them is that depending on how loosely or tightly you knit those stitches, it can actually really cinch things up. So this neckline was laying fairly open, and once I applied that I-cord, it just came right in to this particular size. It's a great size. You do have to be a little careful with the applied I-cord because it's not as stretchy as, say, ribbing or something like that. Some people work it more loosely than others, and that way, you know, you can get a little more flexibility out of your applied I-cord. In this case, I wanted it to be fairly tight because I was moving from a fairly open neckline up to a rather tight neckline. The other thing I decided to do was to add the short rows in down in this lower portion. So that is following the Traista pattern in Lane. I had a quick look at how she did her short rows, whether they were up here or down here. I believe she might even have extra short rows up here, but I cut those out as well. I just worked some short rows here, and so you can see that the back is slightly, this hasn't been washed or blocked, but you can see that the back is slightly higher than the front, and that's because those short rows were worked in a horseshoe right after setting up the provisional cast on for the sleeves. So that's the story of my Space Invaders to Gryffindor to Traista sweater, and I quite like the result. Like I said, a couple of these colors were called for in the original pattern, I think, maybe the light ash, slopey, but I substituted at least one, if not two, of the colors for colors that I had in my stash, and I really love the effect of it. This all needs to be blocked out, but I think you can see there's some subtlety here. So this is like a much lighter, I think this is a light heather ash, this is a dark heather ash, I think, and then this is just, I can't remember, I think this might be coal, or I can't remember what the name of this color is, but it's a very kind of dark black. And then this red color is the yarn that I got on sale a couple of months ago. So there you have it. So it's a story with a happy ending, and I just find it really interesting as I was, you know, knitting with this other color combination, like how many iconic color combos there are out there. In the US, and I think maybe in the UK, I often think of certain color combos as being really associated with sports teams or school colors, and maybe you do too. And it's just, I always think it's so interesting that we can kind of like trigger ourselves culturally with like just a very basic color combination will just bring up all of these different associations with sports or schools or teams or things like that. Whereas this kind of combination doesn't necessarily have that affiliation. You know, it doesn't quite hit those notes. It hits some other notes, some other artistic, kind of creative, beautiful, algorithmic, mathematical happiness notes or something like that. Anyway, the Space Invader sweater, by the way, it's gonna happen. I just need to get some black Lopi yarn, and probably not this color. Okay, I'm going to do a quick change out because we want to talk a little bit about other sweater modification things before we do a little wool felting at the end. So we have a quick costume change here because I want to talk about a couple of the sweaters that I picked up at the local Goodwill when I was working on that sweater cloning class, which is available over on Teachable. So the idea behind that class is that if you have a store-bought sweater that you want to clone and make your own and maybe modify along the way, that class gives you lots of different tips and tricks for how to clone a store-bought sweater. So of course I had to go buy some sweaters. But I always try to get secondhand sweaters because they're really interesting to work with and learn from. And that class will help you take apart different sweaters and understand how they're constructed and then put them back together the way you want to put them back together. But I thought these two sweaters were pretty interesting to talk about a little bit. This one is kind of like a grandpa sweater. So it has a couple of pockets here down at the bottom, buttons, and this shawl collar. It is ribbing all the way through the whole body and sleeves, but it's an interesting example of a cool sweater that might be fun to clone, and it has front pockets, much like this one. This is not 100% wool. It's a wool blend, and from a big box store that I got for like a couple dollars at the at the secondhand store. And this one is also from the secondhand store, and it is 100% wool. I found a couple, just two, 100% wool sweaters, which is awesome. And I know a bunch of you who watch the podcast, I've talked to you in different comments and stuff. You often go to the shops, buy secondhand sweaters that are wool, and then unravel them and use the yarn. You just soak the yarn or steam the yarn, and then you can just knit with it again, which is a wonderful practice, and I totally love that. And I had kind of thought that I was going to do that with this sweater because it's a little short, right? If I put this on, it's wonderful because it's 100% wool, and it really is it's beautifully made. All of the cuffs and the collar and the bottom, it's all turned, all the hems are turned. This one has a knitted band along the bottom to like keep all the stitches in good place. It has a completely functioning zipper, that kind of look to it, and it's basically knit in this stockinette marled yarn, so it would be a good candidate for unraveling in a lot of different ways. But because it's a finished sweater and it's 100% wool, my first thought is to preserve it, like keep it alive as a sweater, right? There's a lot of work in this, a lot of, whether it's human labor or machine labor, it's still a complete sweater. So my first impulse is to like keep it alive and complete. But the problem here is that it's short. And the turned hem is not large enough. You can see that because it has this band here, it's not large enough to actually like just unstitch the hem and let it go longer. Now there are a few options here, and these are some of the things that came to my mind, and I'd love to know what you all think. We talked about this a little bit on the Saturday Zoom. One option would be to, of course, spin up or purchase a yarn that's similar to this. This is a kind of marled, oatmeal-y gray yarn. It's not that hard to find a pretty close substitute for this kind of thing. But sometimes finding a close substitute isn't always the best thing, right? If you're trying to match a particular blue or a particular gray or something like that, oftentimes if you get close but not quite, it looks weirder than if you had just gone for like a totally different color. So with this one, the other option would be to pick up stitches along the inside here, or even just unravel this and get the live stitches, and then knit down with a stripe of a different color. That could be kind of an interesting accent. On our Zoom session, we were talking about necklines a couple weeks ago, and Janelle had just this wonderful modification she had done of this sweater where she had completely fixed and altered the neckline even though it was in progress, and she had already basically finished the sweater. And her fix was so perfect that she held up the sweater and you could not see where she had made them. She pointed them out, of course, like the knitter knows, like, oh, but look right here. And we were like, no, I don't see it. It looks perfect. So you can do those kinds of modifications. And one of the suggestions for necklines that aren't working, someone else had a kind of like open neckline. I think Mary had an open neckline. And one of the suggestions was to pick up stitches inside that neckline and then knit upward so that it creates just another layer of fabric. Interesting idea. So I thought you could also do that down here at the hem. But I'm a little bit inclined to, I didn't like either of those solutions totally for this sweater, but as I was sitting here and looking at it, I realized the pockets are knit in the same yarn, and they're basically detached pockets. So there's the fabric on the front of the sweater would still be complete if I detached these pockets and pulled out the yarn. And I started to think, oh, that would be kind of cool. You could actually pull out the yarn that is associated with this pocket and re-knit a pocket out of some other yarn, maybe a really cool contrast yarn for the inside, right? And then use this yarn, put it together, spit splice it, it's wool. I mean, do the basics, try to get as much yardage as you can out of it, and use this yarn for adding some length to the bottom of the sweater. So I was kind of like, that's a cool idea, I like that. Now this sweater that I'm wearing, it wouldn't quite work. The pockets are knit, but they are knit in a smaller, kind of dark fingering weight yarn. So it's not the same yarn as the sweater itself, whereas this sweater actually has the same yarn in these floating pockets. So we'll see if I get to that. I have a pile of mending that needs to be done. Remember I mentioned those top-down sleeves that often catch. I have a couple of sweaters sitting in my closet just waiting for me to do a very basic mending job on them, which I've done before on both of those sweaters because they always wear out in the same place. And it just hasn't happened yet. So I need to spend a week, maybe since the Shorn yarn is now launched and there's a little bit of a lull. Maybe this will be the week that I get out the sweaters that need to be mended, the sweaters that need to be lengthened, you know, just kind of do a lot of those mods. I did that last season, and I feel like it was maybe in the spring, but maybe it was in the fall. And it was a really satisfying, I think it only took a day. Maybe it was like one weekend day, like one Saturday or Sunday. I piled up all the sweaters that needed to be modified, and I just sat there modifying them. And it really, I think it took a day. It's one of those tasks where you're like, avoid it, avoid it, avoid it, and then it takes 10 minutes, right? So I think this might be my week for mending, because this sweater has just been sitting. It's a beautiful sweater, and it's just been sitting on top of my sweater box because I've just been like, what do I do with it? Do I want to unravel it? Do I want to fix it? Do I want to change it? Do I want to like, what do you want to do with it? So I think I have some ideas now. We'll see what happens with it. All right, last but certainly not least, this past week I gave myself a little bit of me time to have some fun with some wool felting. And I've been working on some wool felting. I think I talked about this a couple episodes ago when Spencer came on. I bought a couple of kits from a wonderful woman up in Canada, and she sent, you know, basically the foam pad and some basic felting needles and all kinds of different little tiny balls of wool to be used for the felting and some felt squares and things like that. I tried to copy a couple of hers, like she has instructions for like how to do this needle felting. And I copied a couple of hers. One of them was better than the other. And then I started like free-handing one, like, you know, Spencer was on here, we talked about like in the summer I took a picture of the fields and I, you know, made my own little needle felted thing from that picture. So then I started thinking, well, maybe I can just find other pictures that I like online and try to copy them with wool. And it's often one of those things where you're learning something new, and I think my impulse is usually to try to copy something that's out there in the world and to learn the techniques that way. And I think it makes sense because I modify sweaters, so it would make sense to kind of like look at photographs and modify them for this needle felting. I don't know, maybe it's the same way of thinking. But anyway, I found a picture of a beautiful mountain lake. Spencer and I go backpacking a lot, and we have lots of photos of mountain lakes, but this one was online. And I wish I could remember the name of the lake. I'll put the photo up here so that you can see it. And I just decided to needle felt it. So this is my latest creation. I haven't done any of the kind of embroidery or other finishing touches on this, and I haven't framed it or done anything other than just the needle felting. But I really love the way that the colors worked out, the blending of the colors for the water and the sky, and even like working on trying to learn things like the shadows for the trees, and thinking about different textures for the flowers that were in the foreground or the rocks and things like that. So that's the latest, the mountain lake needle felting experiment. And I really think that at this point what I'd love to do is go back in, maybe put this in a hoop or something, or maybe just freehand it. But I'd like to embroider some of those finishing touches on top into the trees and maybe into the flowers down here or some of the rocks and things like that. When I used to do counted cross stitch, that was the kind of finishing move that you would do to really make the thing pop. So I'd been sitting there like doing the little X's with all the different colors and working with like half strings and full strings and changing the color. Like it was a beautiful pattern that had a lot of subtlety to it. But the minute that I went back in with my embroidery thread, some of it was like gold embroidery thread or black embroidery thread, whatever it was, to do those little stitches, you know, just on the top of the fabric, or to do the, I think one of them had a costume that had some gold embroidered on it. There was a peacock in one where you embroidered around each of the feathers to kind of give it, you know, some distinct shapes and things like that. I feel like that's what would make this, like, take it to the next level, you know, would be like do a little bit more embroidery kind of thing to give some distinction to all the different elements that are going on here. So yeah, I'm pretty happy about this. I find this to be really relaxing and fun. If you've never tried needle felting and you've been interested in it, I think I said this on the last episode that I talked about it, it's such a like low stakes, low impact thing to get into. If you're like me, you have wool lying around anyway, probably braids of wool or other little bits and pieces of wool, or you can buy a kit that has lots of different colors, and you just need a needle. Like, that's it. It's very simple. And, you know, like maybe a foam pad underneath your felting. That's it. Like, it's not a high cost kind of thing to get into. So yeah, I've been really enjoying it. I find it really relaxing to stab things in the evenings, I'll admit it, when I'm not knitting. And this kind of result makes me really happy. So yeah, that's my mountain lake. And it's the last kind of crafty thing I was working on over the past couple of weeks. So I'd love to know if any of you are multi-craftual, as Felicia Lowe of Sweet Georgia Yarn says. Like, those of you who do multiple things and not just knitting, I'd love to know what it is that you do. Like, if you're doing paper art, if you're also crocheting, if you bake, if you do all kinds of other gardening, you know, things that make you feel happy as a creative person. I'd love to know about them. So yeah. We have the giveaway winner for 2 skeins of Shorn 4, and that is Janet Von Holt. Janet, who is knitting away on Ravelry. Congratulations, Janet, for winning these skeins of yarn. You just need to send me your info, your address via email so that I can get these in the post to you. Congratulations on winning those. And the next giveaway is for this episode, and that is a copy of the Ziggy hat pattern. Since all those patterns are going up on Ravelry this next week, I wanted to give away a copy of my Ziggy hat pattern. So this is, again, the Ziggy hat. It has a turned brim with ribbing on the inside, and it has this fun textured cable-y pattern on the outside. Fairly simple to learn, easy repeat, and it just takes a skein of yarn to do it. So I'll give away a copy of the pattern for this hat in the comments for this episode. You should just comment below, let me know just something that's happened this autumn that's been wonderful. I'd like to know what's happening out in your world, and something good. Tell me something good that's happening, and I'll enter you to win the pattern for the Ziggy hat. I'll do a drawing in a couple weeks' time by randomly picking someone, and I'll send that PDF off to you. So thanks for hanging out with me in the yarn room. Congratulations to Janet Von Holt for winning those couple of skeins of Shorn yarn. I will be getting those out in the post to you soon, Janet. And in the meantime, I hope you enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. So take good care, everybody. Bye.